This is The World This Weekend. Good evening, I'm Stephanie Skandaris. Tonight, yet another deadly attack on the TTC as calls to make Toronto transit safer grow even more urgent.
I cannot imagine what the family is going through right now, and it's something that should not be happening in our city in 2023.
Also tonight, the U.S. wades into the allegations of interference by the Chinese government in Canadian elections.
There's no breach of trust with Canada whatsoever.
And how the cost of living crisis here is pushing Mexico City residents out of their own neighborhoods.
If we want to control gentrification and touristification in some form, the state has to intervene.
That's later, but first. Safety on Toronto's transit system is top of mind again after a 16-year-old boy was stabbed in what police say was a random attack. He was taken to hospital where he died of his injuries. Police say a 22-year-old man of no fixed address has been charged with first-degree murder. It's the latest in a long list of recent violent incidents that have left many riders feeling unsafe. As Philip Lishanok tells us, it's a growing problem outside Toronto as well, and there are calls for a national solution.
Toronto police say the boy was waiting at a subway station in the city's West End Saturday night when he was stabbed in an unprovoked attack.
I cannot imagine what the family is going through right now, and it's something that should not be happening in our city in 2023.
Vincent Puhaka is with the transit advocacy group TTC Riders. He says this is the latest in a string of cases of violence on the Toronto Transit Commission system. Violence against passengers rose 46% last year to more than 1,060 violent incidents compared to 700 in 2021. It prompted the city to add about 80 police officers to patrol the system. Funding for that program ended 2 weeks ago.
We don't actually know if the extra policing helped. What we will say as TTC riders is that you can't police your way out of a social crisis.
Puhaka blames cuts to the transit service.
If people are waiting longer for their bus or streetcar, it's going to be more unsafe. And if ridership declines, it's going to be more unsafe. A transit system that is frequent and well used is in fact safer.
Torontonians, Canadians don't feel safe riding public transit.
John DeNino is the national president of the Amalgamated Transit Union Canada. He says he receives between 2,000 and 3,000 reports of violence against transit workers every year. And he says that violent attacks on public transit have reached crisis levels.
Fearing that you may be the next victim of an assault or an attack. You don't have to be a victim. You don't have to get stabbed or shot or physically assaulted to feel the impacts of these kinds of things.
And DeNino is calling for a national transit safety task force.
We invite increased vigilance by police forces, but that's not the only solution here. What we need to look at is what are the best practices for the safety of our riders and our workers? What are the best practices and things that we need to do in terms of assisting those who are in crisis, whether it's homelessness, whether it's addiction issues.
And it's not just Toronto. Incidents of violence on public transit have been reported in other cities, such as Edmonton, Calgary, and Halifax. The number of calls to police about violent crime on Edmonton's transit system increased nearly 53% between 2021 and 2022. Edmonton's Transit Advisory Board says many parents don't feel the system is safe for their children. Michelle Peter-Jones is the vice chair of the advisory board.
Parents were pretty blunt. While convenient that they didn't have to drive their children to school and back every day, transit was perceived as very unsafe for young people and children. They did not feel that ETS was doing a good job of keeping their children safe.
And with transit services across the country trying to recover from all-time lows in ridership levels due to the pandemic, transit advocates say they will need to resist calls to cut budgets, since it will have an impact on marginalized areas and people will be reluctant to use public transit if they don't feel safe. Philip Lishanok, CBC News, Toronto.
The White House is downplaying a plan by Russian President Vladimir Putin to move nuclear weapons into Belarus. It comes as Europe is threatening to sanction Moscow's ally if Belarus does indeed host the weapons. Thomas Dagla has the latest from Washington.
Under a cold rain in a small town in western Russia, men carry a casket draped in red to honor a fallen soldier. Moscow doesn't reveal how many casualties it suffered in its war on Ukraine, but the long faces in Boghoroditsk underline the losses are real. And President Vladimir Putin is openly musing about stepping up the offensive in a whole new way. In an interview on Russian state TV, Putin said he's been in talks with his ally from Belarus, President Alexander Lukashenko, and that they agreed to move tactical nuclear weapons to Ukraine's northern neighbor. The arms would remain under Russian control in Belarus, Putin said, giving him nuclear firepower near NATO member Poland.
They are trying to not lose this war essentially by rattling the nuclear saber.
That's Yuri Sak, an advisor to Ukraine's defense minister. Today, Kyiv called for an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council, while White House spokesman John Kirby downplayed Moscow's intimidation.
We've seen nothing that would indicate Mr. Putin is preparing to use tactical nuclear weapons in any way.
It's not the first time Putin implies he's willing to deploy nuclear arms in this invasion. And some observers say the fact he's again raising the prospect now speaks volumes. Jill Doherty is a Russia expert at Georgetown University.
I do not think that it's a panic time or anything like that. It's Putin trying to escalate because he has problems.
It was just last week that Putin welcomed China's leader Xi Jinping to Moscow. The visit highlighted the close ties between the two autocrats. Xi left without publicly promising to supply Russia with weapons, but he may be giving Moscow a leg up in a different way.
Putin has found himself an ally strong enough to back him.
King's College London researcher Marina Miron says the relationship may be emboldening Putin to make threats like this one.
Knowing that China, to a certain extent, is backing Russia.
The European Union is warning Belarus of further sanctions as NATO calls Putin's message dangerous and irresponsible. Thomas Daigle, CBC News, Washington.
The U.S. government is backing up Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and his government's response to allegations of foreign election interference. In an interview on Rosemary Barton Live, senior American security official John Kirby says he has full confidence in Canada's intelligence sharing system. Marina von Stackelberg reports.
This whole issue is a reminder of how precious democratic institutions are and free and fair elections are.
John Kirby is the United States National Security Council spokesperson.
And we will work together with Canada to preserve the dignity of those institutions.
He says the recent leaks of spy documents to the media has not hurt the relationship between Canada and its Five Eyes allies. It's an intelligence sharing alliance with the U.S., the U.K., Australia, and New Zealand.
There's no breach of trust with Canada or the Five Eyes relationship whatsoever.
The Prime Minister has been under weeks of pressure. A series of stories from the Globe and Mail and Global News allege China interfered in the last two federal elections. Opposition parties want to know what the Liberal government knew and when they knew it. Kirby says the U.S. deals with election interference, too.
And we share Prime Minister Trudeau's deep concerns over this. He has launched an investigation. We understand the Parliament is also looking into this. We think that's the right thing to do. In the United States, he'll have a friend and a partner should he need any in that work.
Colin Robertson, a former diplomat and fellow with the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, says the Americans are the biggest providers of intelligence in the Five Eyes alliance, so they would be concerned with leaks in Canada.
When there is a breach of security, as there has been over the last month on the Canadian part, obviously our allies are concerned because the intelligence they provide to us, they want to be sure will be respected.
During his visit to Ottawa, U.S. President Joe Biden did not publicly weigh in on election interference in Canada. But during their shared press conference, Trudeau said it's a challenge to all democracies.
It's why over the past number of years, the President and I have had many conversations about this, and indeed, we'll continue to work together with our democratic allies around the world to keep our institutions and our democracies safe from foreign interference.
Trudeau has appointed a special rapporteur who has 2 months to decide whether an independent public inquiry is warranted, but calls from the opposition continue for one to be called immediately. Marina von Stackelberg, CBC News, Ottawa.
In Jerusalem tonight, Protesters breached the barricades near Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's home. Police reportedly used water cannon to push back the protesters. The demonstrations are against the government's planned judicial overhaul. Earlier today, Netanyahu sacked his defense minister, Yoav Gallant, one day after he called for the government to pause its reforms. The heads of Israel's opposition have criticized Gallant's firing, saying Netanyahu crossed a red line. As Iris Mackler tells us, the growing opposition at home might also be weakening some of Israel's key alliances abroad.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu took his troubles with him to London this weekend. As he walked along Downing Street to meet UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, he was greeted by hundreds of protesters waving Israeli flags and calling out shame, busha in Hebrew. The London protesters, like the ones in Israel, fear that Netanyahu's judicial reforms threaten Israel's democracy. His arguments that the reforms will make Israel more democratic, not less, by reducing the power of unelected judges, fails to convince London protester Sharon Shochat.
We're here to make a very clear stand against what's going on in Israel these days, the chaos unleashed by this government.
Netanyahu's Downing Street meeting was brief. There were no TV cameras and no joint statement, but at least there was a meeting. Unlike with Washington.
Oh, it's extraordinarily unusual, Iris.
Alon Pinkas is a former Israeli consul general in New York.
In fact, he's the first of the last 13 prime ministers who, within 90 days of his inauguration or his coalition being sworn in, has neither visited nor been invited to the White House. And this is rare and this is deliberate.
US President Joe Biden did speak to Netanyahu for 45 minutes last week. It's been reported he raised two issues: the possibility the judicial reforms will erode the checks and balances protecting Israeli democracy, and the need for Netanyahu's right-wing government to try to calm relations with the Palestinians after months of escalation.
Well, it's very dangerous.
Alon Pinkas is concerned about the impact of this cooling of relations with Washington.
If this goes on, if the constitutional crisis that is engulfing Israel escalates, which is a 50% possibility, and policy in the West Bank escalates, which is an over 50% likelihood of happening, then the U.S. will have to weigh its options and consider even further moves.
Netanyahu has also not made an official visit to the United Arab Emirates, something he's been angling for as a driving force behind the Abraham Accords, the deal signed with the UAE and Washington in 2020. But so far Netanyahu's government has ignored the dip in relations with Washington, along with warnings from military leaders and economists, and of course hundreds of thousands of protesters out on the streets. The government still says it intends to pass judicial reform bills this coming week, including one to change the way Supreme Court judges are chosen. Iris Mackler for CBC News, Jerusalem.
An urgent search is underway in Mississippi and Alabama for any survivors of a devastating tornado. At least 26 people are dead. Towns are completely leveled. State and federal aid are being mobilized. Tonight, Susanna Da Silva brings us some of the heart-wrenching stories of survival and loss.
Ceiling tiles and insulation crashed to the ground, cables whipped in the wind. Captured on surveillance camera in a Mississippi high school, destruction from a storm that had already been obliterating towns for almost 2 hours and hundreds of kilometers.
It was right on top of us. And I was like, man, I just knew our house was gone.
In Rolling Fork, 300 kilometers away, Dontavis Brown took cover.
I just hit the ground. I just laid on top of everybody that was in the house with me. I was just thinking about their safety.
With more than 24 dead so far, those who didn't survive the destruction are being remembered.
This is a community where everybody knows everybody.
Tamika James Jones says her friend Robert Lee died trying to protect his wife as they took cover in their bathroom. Lee's wife survived.
Kind person, very bubbly spirit, always outgoing, wonderful teacher.
Federal officials were in the communities promising support for residents and local officials like Rolling Fork Mayor Eldridge Walker.
I'm not only just the mayor of this community, but I've lost personal friends. I'm also the local funeral director. Now, I'm having to meet my families, those who have lost loved ones, and help them make it through.
Experts say to see a path of destruction for that long and that far is exceedingly rare.
This is worst case scenario for tornadoes, and it was just about as scary as you can get.
Mark Robinson is a meteorologist and has been chasing storms in Canada and the U.S. for more than 20 years. He was fearfully watching the radar on Friday night.
This storm itself, the supercell storm, can continue to go for a very, very, very long time. So to have a tornado accompanying that supercell for that entire path, that's unusual because everything has to be absolutely balanced perfect.
This is the beginning of the tornado season in the area, and this morning another tornado caused extensive damage in Georgia, and there is potential for more storms today in the areas hardest hit on Friday.
It's just very sad. It's very sad.
Rebecca Cooper and her husband Stephen have started cleaning up their bake shop that was almost leveled. They promise they'll start over.
Rebuild and get the roof fixed, walls fixed, see what we can do.
A difficult job now facing many in the region. Susana da Silva, CBC News, Vancouver.
There is confusion in Lebanon as residents woke up in 2 different time zones this morning. Last week, caretaker Prime Minister Najib Mikati announced he would delay daylight saving time until the end of Ramadan, allowing Muslims to break their fasts earlier. But Christian organizations in the country have moved forward with the time change. This man in Beirut says the move will create religious discord in the country.
The government creates problems to deepen the divisions between Muslims and Christians because those in power benefit when the people are in disagreement.
However, many in Lebanon are taking the situation in good humor.
Hey, this is definitely a weird historic moment.
Adding to the confusion, many media outlets moved the clock forward, while Middle East Airlines has adopted a half measure. It's keeping its clocks and other devices on winter time, but adjusting its flight times to keep in line with international schedules. Well, the rising cost of living in Canada's biggest cities means an increasing number of people are being priced out of their own neighbourhoods. But instead of relocating to a different part of town, some have opted to move to an entirely new country. The search for more affordability, however, carries a high cost for others. Mandy Sham brings us that story from Mexico City.
Every day, 20 million people in and around Mexico City wake up to a familiar soundtrack. An orchestra of taco stand maestros, the hum of traffic, and a concerto of sizzling flat tops and street vendors. But cross 2 blocks and all that can change. In the neighborhood of Condesa, plant-filled patios are filled with a loyal clientele, basking in the winter sunlight and munching on flaky French pastries. Here, it's not so much about what you hear, but what you don't. Fewer cars, and even fewer words in Spanish. Since the start of the pandemic, Mexico City has seen an astonishing increase in expats and digital nomads. But that's not the only thing rising quickly.
Los precios subieron mucho. Las rentas subieron demasiado.
Erika Victoria Lopez says prices and rents have gone up a lot since. Last year, she listed her spare room on Airbnb to make ends meet. Some residents in Mexico City say it's that same rental platform that's caused a lot of grief and frustration, displacing locals who have lived in these neighborhoods for generations.
Like rents used to be like 10,000 pesos, 12,000 pesos, 16,000 pesos. You have apartments now that are like 56,000 pesos a month.
Scriptwriter Lucia Canjura blames city officials for not regulating short-term rentals. In fact, Mexico City's government has actively incentivized remote work. Last October, it partnered with Airbnb and UNESCO to promote the city to foreigners.
I think Mexico City is a vortex. It's such a spiritually charged place, and the people here are very open.
Mexican culture and the warmer weather are just some of the things attracting Canadian Rachel Hale. But she says it's the astronomical cost of living in her hometown of Toronto that ultimately informed her decision to move.
You know, I grew up in the city. I'm a downtown kid, and I can't even afford to buy a house in my city that I grew up in anymore.
Many people like Hale have left their own countries for the same reason. That high cost of living and inflation have priced people out, and their arrival in relatively affordable cities has knocked more than just a few dominoes. In the span of just a few years, hundreds of conventional apartments in touristy neighborhoods have been converted into short-term rentals. Adrián Hernández Cordero is a geographer at the Autonomous Metropolitan University of Iztapalapa. He says the damage of what he calls super gentrification isn't just the displacement of entire communities. It's also the erosion of deeply rooted cultural identities.
If we want to control gentrification and touristification in some form, the state has to intervene. The Mexican government has to work to reduce the proliferation of Airbnb in places where there's already a high density of such housing.
Cordero notes gentrification has brought some positive developments, such as more diversity and inclusion, and the improvement of social services and public safety. Mexico City resident Rodrigo Martinez agrees, but
security is something that the government should guarantee for all of the population, not just for the well-done areas.
Martinez knows what it's like to move to different cities and believes everyone should be welcome. But he admits neighborhoods like Roma and Condesa have evolved into an aspirational dream for most Mexicans.
I feel like a tourist here, and I see that the real tourists in here feel at home.
Mandy Sham, CBC News, Mexico City.
Pakistan's former Prime Minister Imran Khan was granted bail on Tuesday, a brief reprieve in a turbulent few weeks for the cricketer turned politician. Last week, police who had come to arrest Khan at his house in Lahore were met with violence from his supporters. Khan faces dozens of charges related to corruption and terrorism, but his popularity remains sky high. Pakistani journalist and political commentator Umber Rahim Shamsi explains why on the CBC podcast, Nothing is Foreign.
And while he was in government between 2018 to 2022, his performance wasn't, he didn't fulfill a lot of the promises he made, and we saw his popularity graph drop a little. Since his ouster in April, he's actually, become extremely popular. And the current government that led the vote of no confidence against him and who has seen a massive drop in their popularity simply because food inflation is touching 40%, which doesn't seem to be managing either the economy well or politics really well. And it does feel a little like in order to prevent Imran Khan from either winning or gaining more seats than he could, perhaps this is one way. On the other hand, I will say that this is also a kind of a cycle of political revenge that I see, because while Imran Khan was in power, he put many of these leaders who are now in power behind bars, accused them of corruption, and demonstrated a sort of vengeful streak himself. So it feels a little like the cycle has changed, the faces have changed. Before it was the current group of parties who were on target, and now it's Imran Khan.
You can listen to the rest of this episode on Nothing is Foreign, available wherever you get your podcasts. Ah, the crack of the bat, the roar of the crowd. It's hard to believe baseball season is right around the corner, but when the boys of summer hit the diamond next week, they'll be rounding the bases a bit quicker than usual. That's because of new league rules aimed at speeding up the pace of the game. To break it down for us, we reached Caitlin McGrath. She covers the Toronto Blue Jays for The Athletic, and we spoke to her a little earlier. So, Caitlin, what are these new rules and how do they work?
The kind of biggest, most noticeable new rule that fans will see is the pitch clock. Essentially, pitchers have 15 seconds to throw a pitch or 20 seconds if there are runners on base. And that's obviously sped up the game quite a bit. Another noticeable one will be shifting limits. So you won't have the infielders or the outfielders able to have those extreme shifts that they used to. And another one that's pretty noticeable is the larger bases. Obviously, that's been a big change. They've gotten significantly bigger. And so those are kind of the three that really stand out. But I would say the pitch clock is probably the most noticeable one and the one that's brought about the most change.
Mm-hmm. And what's the reasoning behind these changes?
Yeah, I think there's a few reasons. I mean, a big reason is obviously pace of play. And within that, it's not so much, cutting down the length of games, although that certainly is part of it, but it's also just kind of increasing action or probably decreasing dead time in games. And so if you've watched a baseball game in the last 5 years, you've probably noticed that there can be a lot of time in between moments of action. So there's the pitcher's holding on to the ball for a long time. You can go like a minute, sometimes like 2 minutes almost before a pitch is thrown. But there's also, with the larger bases, you could create more incentive to steal bases, which creates more action. With the shifting rules, obviously defenses have to play more true, and so there's a lot more room for hits to get out of the infield because you can't position defenders in the exact way where they can rob some of those hits.
And I mean, the rules have already been put in place during spring training. So how have they worked out so far? Have they changed the game?
Yeah, I would say like the pace of play is definitely noticeable. I was looking at some stats earlier this week, and something like close to 25 minutes have been cut from game times.
Oh, wow.
Which is pretty significant. So, in a standard spring training game, previous years, we were looking around average 3 hours or so. Now they've sort of been much closer to 2.5 on average. So obviously you're going to have some games that are quicker, some games that are longer, but it's been significant in terms of how much more quickly games are going by.
And what's been the reaction so far?
The pitch clock, it's an adjustment certainly for players and even for fans, getting used to paying attention to that. But I think it's actually been good for the game. And I think it adds another element of kind of strategy and the mental side of baseball. Honestly, like pitchers really have to, know their game plan ahead of time, and they have to really be on the same page with the catchers. And hitters, it affects hitters too, obviously. Like they can't step out of the box so often. They've got to be ready to go. It's an adjustment for everybody, but I think it's been mostly positive.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about pace of play, but I think some people might prefer the more relaxed pace of baseball. Like living here in Toronto, especially, if you go to a game in the summer, you're going to be there for a few hours. You're definitely spending an afternoon there. May not be for everybody, but I mean, what would you say to baseball traditionalists who might be opposed to speeding things up, who kind of like the relaxed, chill, take your time kind of feel of it?
I would say, like, honestly, you're not really cutting into the essence of baseball with these rules. You're just quickening it up. It's not going to all of a sudden look like a hockey game. It's not going to be that high pace or anything like that. Like, you're still going to get all the charm that comes with going to the ballpark, watching a baseball game unfold. I think it's just, it's just cutting into some of that time where you're just sitting there and you're like, why isn't anything happening? Why haven't they thrown a pitch? Like, that's kind of what you're cutting into. And again, like, you're not talking about shaving like 2 hours off of games, right? So I think you're still able to take in a baseball game, get your money's worth if you go to the ballpark. And honestly, I think that fans will probably enjoy the increased action once they get used to these new rules.
All right, good to know. Caitlin McGrath writes for The Athletic. She covers the Toronto Blue Jays. Thank you so much for speaking with us.
Of course, thank you.
If you're a soap opera fan, you know that song. If you're not, it's the theme of The Young and the Restless, which debuted 50 years ago today. Throughout the last 5 decades, there has been a lot of drama in Genoa City, Wisconsin. The theme song has been steady throughout, but it's had a dramatic existence of its own. Originally called Cotton's Dream, it was composed by Barry Dvorak and Perry Botkin Jr. for the 1971 movie Bless the Beasts and Children. 2 years later, the song began its best-known existence as the Y&R theme, and a year after that was released as a single by the group Sounds of Sunshine. And restless its next life came after the 1976 Summer Olympics in Montreal, after it was used alongside a montage of Romanian gymnast Nadia Comaneci, becoming known as Nadia's theme. In 2001, the new millennium brought a new version. Mary J. Blige sampled Nadia's theme in her song No More Drama, which even had a little shout out to the soap. Well, maybe I like the stress, 'cause I Today, the theme endures, and so does the show, despite the odds. Y&R is one of only 4 soaps still on the air, and fans are giving it its due. At least until next week, when General Hospital turns 60. You've been listening to The World This Weekend. I'm Stephanie Skandaris. Good night.